My name is Amelia. I am 32 years old, and 4 months ago I watched my older sister collapse onto the floor of a crowded Scottsdale steakhouse, clutching her chest and gasping for air. It was my promotion dinner. I had just been named Senior Vice President of Operations for one of Arizona's largest hospital networks. My parents, Thomas and Brenda, were screaming for an ambulance, pointing fingers at me, shouting that my selfishness had caused Chloe to have a heart attack. I didn't panic. I paid the bill and drove to my hospital. When the doors to Trauma Bay 1 slid open, my father demanded the chief of emergency save his precious daughter. The attending physician walked out, glanced at the chart, looked through the glass at my sister, and let out a dry laugh. "Her vitals are textbook perfect," he said. "She is faking a panic attack." My mother threatened to have him fired, demanding if he knew who her other daughter was the executive. The doctor smiled, slipped his arm around my waist, and looked my father in the eye. "I know exactly who Amelia is. She is the senior VP. She is also my fiancé." The horror on their faces was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. But that fake hospital visit was just the opening act of a criminal scheme that would ultimately end with my father in handcuffs. Before I tell you how a forged signature tore this family apart, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Orange Revenge, but only if this kind of justice resonates with you. Also, drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments. I always read them. Now, to understand the silence in that hospital hallway, you have to understand the dynamic of the Harrison family. Growing up in the desert heat of the Phoenix suburbs, the rules of our household were unspoken but enforced with iron precision. Chloe was the sun. I was just the girl expected to burn up in her orbit. It wasn't a loud, chaotic kind of favoritism. It was methodical. My milestones were treated as inconveniences, while Chloe's missteps were treated as tragedies, requiring immediate family mobilization. When I graduated college with honors, Chloe twisted her ankle stepping off a curb. My graduation dinner was quietly canceled so my mother could ice Chloe's foot on the sofa. When I bought my first townhouse down in Tempe, Chloe's husband Brad lost his third consecutive startup business. My father drove to my new house, stood in my living room, and suggested I let them move in rent-free until Brad found his footing. I said no. My parents refused to speak to me for 6 months. They called it tough love. I called it clarity. I learned a very vital lesson during those 6 months of silence. Sharing my joy only gave them a target to dismantle. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to build something that belonged solely to me, I had to do it in the shadows. So I did. I climbed the corporate healthcare ladder without updating them on my title changes. I invested my money, and when I met Julian, I kept him hidden. Julian was a brilliant ER attending. He had calm, steady hands and a way of seeing right through the noise. We met during a hospital charity drive, and from our first cup of coffee in the cafeteria, he understood me. We got engaged during a sunrise hike in Sedona, just the two of us, the red rocks, and a quiet promise. I knew if I brought him to a Sunday dinner, Chloe would either manufacture a crisis to ruin the evening or spend the night touching his arm, asking inappropriate questions to make me uncomfortable. Our bubble was safe, but a hospital board doesn't keep secrets. When they voted to promote me to Senior VP, a role that came with a public announcement, a steep salary increase, and regional prestige, I knew the walls of my quiet life were about to be breached. I had to tell my parents, and I knew exactly how much they would hate it. To understand how we ended up in that hospital corridor facing off over a faked heart attack, you have to look at the pattern. My family operated on a very specific currency, and that currency was Chloe's convenience. My milestones were never celebrated. They were simply obstacles in the way of my sister's perpetual need for attention. I learned this lesson the hard way during my college graduation. I had just finished my degree at Arizona State with a flawless grade point average. I was 22 years old, standing in the living room of my cramped college apartment, wearing my cap and gown. I had made reservations at a beautiful restaurant in downtown Phoenix for the three of us. My parents had promised to be there. I waited by the door for an hour. My phone finally buzzed. It was my mother, Brenda. Her tone was rushed, breathless, carrying that familiar frantic energy she reserved exclusively for my sister. "We cannot make it to dinner," she said, not offering a single word of apology. Chloe was walking out of a boutique in Old Town Scottsdale and stepped off the curb wrong. She rolled her ankle. "We are taking her to urgent care." I stood there staring at the blank television screen in my living room. I asked if Chloe was seriously injured. My mother scoffed. "She is in terrible pain, Amelia. You need to be more compassionate. You can go to dinner another time, but your sister needs us right now." The line went dead. I took off my graduation gown, hung it in the closet, and ate a cold sandwich standing over my kitchen sink. The next day, I found out Chloe had a minor sprain. She was walking in wedges by the weekend. But my graduation dinner never happened. That was the baseline. But the real shift, the moment I realized I had to build a fortress around my life, happened 3 years later. I had saved every spare dollar from my entry-level hospital administration job to buy my first townhouse. It was a modest place in Phoenix, but it had a small yard and a kitchen filled with natural light. I signed the closing papers on a Tuesday. By Thursday afternoon, I was unpacking boxes in the living room, enjoying the smell of fresh paint and independence. A heavy knock rattled my front door. I opened it to find my father Thomas standing on the welcome mat. He did not say congratulations. He did not ask for a tour. He walked past me, looked around the empty living room, and crossed his arms. "Brad lost his job again," my father announced. Brad was Chloe's husband. Calling his previous endeavors jobs was a generous interpretation. Brad was a serial entrepreneur whose ventures always mysteriously collapsed after he spent the initial investment capital on luxury cars and expensive golf clubs. His latest failure involved a specialized logistics company that tanked within 8 months. I asked my father what Brad's employment status had to do with me. Thomas turned around and looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "They cannot afford their rent in Paradise Valley," he said. "You have 3 bedrooms here. It is just you. Chloe and Brad will take the master suite. You can take one of the smaller rooms. It makes sense. They will stay rent-free until Brad gets back on his feet." I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me, listening to him casually demand I surrender my sanctuary to a sister who had never done a single kind thing for me. I felt my pulse steady. The years of swallowing my disappointment vanished, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. "No," I said. My father blinked. "Excuse me. I am not a safety net for Brad's bad decisions," I told him, keeping my voice low and even. "This is my home. I worked 80-hour weeks to buy it. Chloe and Brad are not moving in. They can downsize. They can find real jobs. But they are not living here." Thomas's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He stepped closer, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "You are a selfish, ungrateful daughter," he hissed. "Your sister is in crisis, and you care more about empty bedrooms than your own flesh and blood. Do not expect us to come running the next time you need help." He slammed the front door so hard the framed mirror in the hallway rattled. True to his word, my parents and my sister did not speak to me for 6 months. They expected me to crack. They expected me to call them crying and begging for forgiveness, offering up my spare keys as an apology. Instead, I enjoyed the silence. Those 6 months were the most peaceful period of my life. I woke up without anxious text messages. I spent my weekends decorating my home without unsolicited criticism. The silent treatment was meant to be a punishment, but to me it felt like parole. When they eventually resumed contact acting, as though nothing had happened, the dynamic had permanently altered. I had learned the most valuable rule of surviving the Harrison family. Sharing my joy or my resources only gave them a target to destroy. So I built my life in the shadows. I compartmentalized my existence with surgical precision. Professionally, I became a ghost to them. They knew I worked in hospital administration, but I never shared my promotions. I never disclosed my salary. When I moved from compliance director to vice president of operations, handling multi-million-dollar budgets and negotiating with chief surgeons, I told my parents I was just doing paperwork. I drove a reliable, unremarkable sedan. I dressed modestly around them. I gave them no reason to envy me, which meant they had no reason to sabotage me. And then I met Julian. Julian was a brilliant attending physician in the emergency department. We met during a chaotic Tuesday afternoon when the hospital was upgrading its patient intake software. The system crashed, leaving the ER staff scrambling. While other doctors shouted at the IT department, Julian walked into my office, sat across from my desk, and calmly explained exactly what his nurses needed to keep the floor running. He had steady hands, a sharp mind, and eyes that missed nothing. We worked side by side for 3 hours restoring the workflow. By the end of the shift, he asked me to dinner. I fell for him quickly. Julian was the antithesis of the chaos I grew up with. He was grounded, supportive, and remarkably perceptive. But as our relationship deepened, I made a conscious choice to keep him entirely separated from my family. I knew exactly what would happen if I brought a handsome, successful doctor to a Sunday dinner. Chloe had a long documented history of ruining my relationships. Years ago, I brought a former boyfriend to a family holiday. Chloe spent the entire evening contriving reasons to touch his arm, laughing too loudly at his jokes, and eventually faking a flat tire later that week just so she could call him for help instead of her own husband. She thrived on proving she could capture the attention of anyone who looked my way. I was not going to risk Julian. He was too important. For 2 years, we dated in a beautiful, protected vacuum. He understood why I kept my distance from my parents. He saw the toll their occasional phone calls took on my energy. Last October, Julian took me on a weekend trip to Sedona. We woke up at 4 a.m. to hike Cathedral Rock before the tourists arrived. The desert air was crisp, and the sky was painted in striking shades of violet and gold. When we reached the saddle of the rock formation overlooking the vast canyon, Julian turned to me. He did not give a long theatrical speech. He simply pulled a velvet box from his hiking pack, looked me in the eyes, and asked me to build a quiet life with him. I said yes. It was the easiest decision I have ever made. We did not post pictures of the ring on social media. We did not call my parents to announce the engagement. We celebrated with a quiet dinner, savoring the knowledge that our future belonged only to us. I wore my engagement ring on a delicate chain hidden beneath my blouses when I knew I had to see my family. We were perfectly happy in our invisible bubble. I thought I could keep the two halves of my world separated forever, but success has a way of turning on the lights. A few months after the engagement, the hospital network's chief operating officer announced his retirement. The executive board conducted a nationwide search for a replacement, interviewing candidates from Chicago to Los Angeles. After a grueling 3-month vetting process, the board called me into the executive suite. They voted unanimously to promote me to Senior Vice President of Operations. It was a staggering achievement. At 32, I would be one of the youngest senior executives in the state. The position came with a massive compensation package, stock options, and significant public prestige. My mentor, the outgoing COO, handed me the official contract. "You earned this, Amelia," he said. "The press release goes out to the Phoenix Business Journal and all local medical affiliates next Wednesday." My heart swelled with pride, followed immediately by a sinking feeling of dread. The Phoenix Business Journal. My mother subscribed to that publication. She read it religiously every week, scanning the pages to track the successes and failures of the families in her social circle. There was no hiding this. By next Wednesday, my face and my new title would be printed in glossy color for the entire state to see. The massive salary increase would be public knowledge. The prestige would be undeniable. The fortress I had spent years building in the shadows was about to be breached. I could not let them find out from a magazine. If Brenda read about my promotion before I told her, the perceived disrespect would spark a family war. I had to control the narrative. I had to tell them myself. I called my parents that evening and told them I had some professional news. I offered to take them out for a quick coffee. My mother immediately rejected the idea of coffee. "If you actually achieve something worth mentioning, we are doing a proper dinner," she commanded. "Book a table at the steakhouse on Camelback Road, Friday night. Bring your sister and Brad. It is about time we had a family gathering." I hung up the phone and stared at my kitchen counter. The dread was heavy in my chest. I knew the playbook. They did not want to celebrate me. They wanted to corner me in a high-end restaurant, trap me in public where I could not easily walk away, and figure out how my new success could benefit them. I told Julian about the dinner. He offered to come with me to finally break the seal and stand by my side. I shook my head, securing my engagement ring back onto its hidden chain. "No," I told him. "Let me handle this alone. I do not want them turning their sights on you just yet." I thought I was prepared for whatever guilt trip or financial demand they were going to throw at me. I thought my boundaries were strong enough to withstand one uncomfortable steakhouse dinner. I had no idea the lengths Chloe would go to when she realized she was no longer the most important person in the room. I had no idea that Friday night would end with flashing ambulance lights and the unmasking of a felony. The restaurant Thomas and Brenda chose for my supposed celebration sat in the wealthiest zip code of Scottsdale. It was the kind of establishment where the valet line consisted entirely of imported sports cars, and the lighting was kept intentionally dim to hide the price tags on the menus. Mahogany-paneled walls absorbed the low hum of deals being negotiated over dry-aged ribeyes. My parents loved places like this. They believed proximity to wealth somehow transferred onto them through osmosis. I arrived 10 minutes early, checking my coat and letting the hostess guide me to a leather booth in the back corner. My family walked in together exactly 15 minutes late. This was a classic power play. Making someone wait establishes dominance before a single word is spoken. Thomas led the charge, shaking hands with a maitre d' he did not actually know, projecting the image of a successful patriarch. Brenda followed, scanning the dining room to see who might be watching them. Chloe and Brad trailed behind, looking bored. They slid into the booth opposite me. No one offered a hug. No one said congratulations. Thomas immediately flagged down a sommelier and ordered a $300 bottle of Cabernet without glancing at the price or asking what anyone else wanted to drink. He operated under the assumption that since the dinner was in my honor, I would be the one paying the bill. I settled back against the leather seat and waited. I negotiate complex vendor contracts for a living. I know how to sit in silence and let the other side reveal their agenda. The waiter poured the wine. Brenda took a sip, blotted her lips with a linen napkin, and finally looked across the table at me. "Amelia." She began, her tone carrying the casual dismissiveness she had perfected over 3 decades. "It is nice you got a little promotion at the hospital. VP of whatever it is. It sounds like a lot of paperwork." "Senior Vice President of Operations." I corrected her gently, keeping my voice level. "I oversee the administrative infrastructure for 5 regional campuses." Brenda waved her hand as if swatting away a fly. "Yes, well, it sounds very stable. But we are actually here to discuss something more pressing. Your brother-in-law is experiencing a transition period." I shifted my gaze to Brad. He was swirling the expensive Cabernet in his glass, refusing to make eye contact with me. Brad was a man who spoke in buzzwords. He called himself a visionary. In reality, he was a liability. Last year, he convinced my father to invest in a proprietary logistics software company. The software never functioned. Brad spent the operating budget leasing a premium office space and outfitting it with imported espresso machines. The venture folded in 9 months. Before that, it was an artisan water bottling company that resulted in a lawsuit from a supplier. Brad had 0 healthcare experience, 0 operational background, and a documented history of financial ruin. "Brad is struggling right now." My mother continued, leaning forward and lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "The market is tough for independent founders, but since you have this new title, you clearly have influence. We think it is time you brought him on as a consultant at your hospital." The audacity of the request hung in the air. They had not brought me to this restaurant to celebrate my achievements. They had brought me here to harvest them. They wanted to use my hard-earned credibility to create a fraudulent paycheck for a man who refused to work a legitimate job. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down on the coaster. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. "No," I said. The single syllable landed on the table like a lead weight. Thomas stopped chewing the bread he had just picked up. Brad finally looked at me, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Excuse me," Brenda stammered, her practiced smile dropping instantly. "I am not hiring Brad," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional. A hospital is a highly regulated environment. I manage multi-million-dollar budgets and oversee federal compliance. I cannot hire a consultant who possesses 0 healthcare experience. It would be a violation of ethical standards, and it would put my entire career at risk. The answer is no. Thomas slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, causing the silverware to rattle. "Do not use that corporate jargon with us," he barked. "This is family. Your sister is drowning in debt because her husband hit a streak of bad luck. You have the power to fix it. You just sign a paper, give him a title, and let him collect a paycheck. It costs you nothing." "It cost me my professional integrity," I replied firmly. "I spent 10 years building my reputation. I will not torch it to subsidize Brad. If he needs an income, he can apply for an entry-level position through the human resources portal like everyone else. Chloe slammed her glass down on the table. "You are so arrogant," she hissed. "You get one fancy job title and suddenly you think you are better than us. You have always been selfish. You never share anything. You just hoard your little successes and watch us suffer." I looked at my older sister. I saw the pure, unfiltered resentment burning in her eyes. Chloe had spent her entire life positioned as the superior sibling. She was the one who was supposed to have the glamorous life, the wealthy husband, the envied status. Sitting across from me, confronting the reality that I held the power and she held nothing but debt was breaking her mind. The spotlight had shifted onto me and it was burning her. She could not tolerate my quiet strength. She could not handle my refusal to bow to their demands. Most importantly, she could not endure a scenario where she was not the victim requiring immediate rescue. I could see the gears turning in her head. She needed to derail the conversation. She needed to reclaim the center of the universe. Chloe took a sudden sharp breath. Her eyes went wide. She grabbed the collar of her silk blouse and began to pant loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. "I cannot breathe," she gasped, her voice rising an octave. My chest is tight." I watched her performance with the clinical detachment of someone who spends 60 hours a week walking through medical wards. It was a remarkable piece of bad acting. As she clutched her chest, her other hand instinctively reached down to move her expensive designer handbag out of the way so it would not get stained. She knocked over her $20 cocktail, sending a splash of pink liquid across the white linen tablecloth, and then she allowed her body to slide dramatically out of the booth and onto the hardwood floor. She did not hit her head. She braced her fall perfectly with her forearm, ensuring a soft landing. She lay on the floor near the aisle, kicking her legs slightly and letting out short, rhythmic whimpers. Brenda erupted into hysterics. "Help us!" my mother screamed, jumping up and waving her arms frantically. "My daughter is having a heart attack. Someone call an ambulance." The restaurant descended into immediate chaos. Diners stood up from their meals. Waiters dropped their trays and rushed over. The maitre d' grabbed the telephone at the host stand to dial 911. Brad knelt next to his wife, patting her cheek and shouting her name loudly enough for everyone in the dining room to hear his performance as the terrified husband. Thomas turned to me. His face was twisted in rage. "Look at what you did!" he yelled over the noise of the panicked restaurant. "Your cruelty caused this. You stressed her into a cardiac event." I did not move from the booth. I sat perfectly still, observing my sister on the floor. In a genuine cardiac event, the patient experiences a grayish pallor, profuse sweating, and a distinct loss of muscle control. Chloe possessed a healthy, rosy complexion. Her breathing, despite the dramatic sound effects, was steady and deep. As Brad leaned over her, I clearly saw Chloe open one eye, peek to see how many people were watching, and then quickly squeeze her eyelids shut again, fluttering her lashes for added effect. She was entirely fine. She was weaponizing a fake medical emergency to escape the humiliation of my rejection and punish me for saying no. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet Scottsdale night. 2 paramedics rushed through the heavy wooden doors of the steakhouse, carrying a stretcher and a trauma kit. The crowd parted to let them through. Brenda immediately threw herself at the first medic, grabbing his uniform. "Save her," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "She has a weak heart. It was brought on by severe emotional trauma." The paramedic gently moved my mother aside to assess the patient. He checked Chloe's pulse, applied a blood pressure cuff, and shone a penlight into her eyes. Chloe groaned loudly and let her head loll to the side. "We are going to transport her to Phoenix General," the paramedic announced, signaling to his partner to bring the stretcher closer. "We need to run a full cardiac panel to rule out an infarction. Phoenix General, my hospital." As they lifted Chloe onto the stretcher, Thomas grabbed his suit jacket and glared at me. "I hope you are proud of yourself, Amelia. If anything happens to your sister tonight, it is on your hands. You are a cold, heartless woman." Brenda and Brad hurried out the door behind the stretcher, leaving me alone at the table. The surrounding diners stared at me, their faces full of judgment. They had heard my father's accusations. They believed I was the villain who had just induced a family tragedy. I did not feel the need to defend myself to a room full of strangers. I signaled the waiter, who approached the table with wide, nervous eyes. "I will take the check, please," I said calmly. He handed me the leather folio. The bill was nearly $800. Thomas had ordered the most expensive items on the menu, fully intending to exploit my new salary before launching his consulting demand. I placed my corporate credit card on the tray, added a generous tip for the disruption my family had caused, and signed the receipt. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked out of the restaurant into the warm desert night. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited for my car. My phone was already buzzing in my purse. Text messages from my mother demanding I meet them at the emergency room to face the consequences of my actions. I slid into the driver's seat of my sedan, started the engine, and merged onto the main road, heading toward Phoenix General. My parents believed they had successfully regained the upper hand. They believed the hospital setting would make me vulnerable, that the white coats and medical machinery would force me into submission and guilt. They did not understand that they were walking into my territory. They had chosen to stage their theatrical production inside the exact building where I held the authority, and they were about to encounter the one man who saw through their deception as clearly as I did. I drove through the quiet streets, anticipating the collision of my hidden sanctuary and my family's chaotic reality. The drive to Phoenix General took 20 minutes. I spent the duration of the trip mapping out the logistical realities of my sister's manufactured crisis. A fake heart attack requires genuine hospital resources. It ties up an ambulance. It occupies a trauma bay. It pulls triage nurses and attending physicians away from patients experiencing legitimate, life-threatening emergencies. My family did not care about the collateral damage of their performance. They only cared about securing their leverage. I pulled into the executive parking structure, swiped my keycard, and bypassed the chaotic public entrance. Entering the hospital through the administrative wing allowed me to transition immediately from the role of a targeted daughter to the authority of a senior vice president. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the corridors stripped away the emotional manipulation of the steakhouse. I walked past the surgical waiting area, nodding to the security personnel who recognized me, and approached the double doors of the emergency department. I paused before swiping my badge to enter the restricted clinical zone. Through the reinforced glass, I could observe the scene unfolding outside Trauma Bay 1. It was exactly as I had predicted. Thomas and Brenda were commanding the space, creating a spectacle designed to ensure maximum attention. Thomas paced furiously in front of the nursing station, his face flushed, gesturing wildly as he berated a young triage nurse who was attempting to review intake paperwork. Brenda stood clutching her designer handbag against her chest, weeping loudly for the benefit of the other families seated in the nearby waiting area. Brad hovered near the wall, playing the role of the shell-shocked husband, occasionally running a hand through his hair and sighing heavily. "I need the chief of emergency medicine down here right now," my father bellowed, his voice echoing down the sterile hallway. "My daughter suffered a severe cardiac event. We cannot wait for some junior resident to run tests. She requires top-tier intervention. I demand to speak to the person in charge." The young triage nurse maintained her professional composure, though her shoulders were visibly tense. "Sir, your daughter is currently being evaluated by our lead attending physician. He is reviewing her initial telemetry and lab results. You must remain outside the trauma bay until he completes his assessment." I swiped my badge and stepped through the double doors. The heavy electronic lock clicked shut behind me. I did not approach my family. I stood a few feet away, leaning my shoulder against the cool tile wall, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched them perform. They had not noticed me yet. They were too engrossed in the drama they were constructing. My father's demand for the chief of emergency was a classic Thomas Harrison maneuver. He believed that shouting orders and demanding access to the highest-ranking official automatically validated his status. He utilized this exact tactic at restaurants, at car dealerships, and at banks. He assumed a hospital functioned the same way. He believed volume equated to authority. He did not realize that in a Level 1 trauma center, authority belongs exclusively to the data on the monitor. The frosted glass doors of Trauma Bay 1 slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. Julian stepped out into the hallway. He wore navy blue scrubs, a stethoscope draped loosely around his neck, and held a digital tablet containing the patient charts. He possessed a commanding, steady presence that immediately neutralized the chaotic energy in the corridor. This was the Julian I admired most, the professional who navigated high-stakes medical crises with cool, unshakable precision. He did not look intimidated by my father's shouting. He looked faintly annoyed. Thomas instantly pivoted, rushing toward Julian and invading his personal space. "Doctor, you have to save her!" my father demanded, thrusting a finger toward the glass doors of the trauma bay. Her heart gave out. It was a massive attack brought on by severe psychological distress. "You need to admit her to the cardiac intensive care unit immediately." Julian did not step back. He held his ground, tapping the screen of his tablet to close the medical file. He looked at my father, then shifted his gaze slightly to the right, catching my eye where I stood leaning against the wall. A micro-expression of recognition flickered across his face. We had discussed my family extensively. He knew their tactics. He knew exactly who was lying on the stretcher inside that room, and he knew why she was there. Julian returned his focus to Thomas. He let out a dry, exasperated laugh. It was not a cruel sound, but it carried the distinct weight of a medical professional who had zero tolerance for fabricated emergencies. "Mr. Harrison?" Julian began, his voice calm and entirely devoid of the urgency my father demanded. "I have reviewed the comprehensive intake data. Your daughter's blood oxygen saturation is currently reading at 100%. Her electrocardiogram shows a flawless, perfectly normal sinus rhythm. We ran a rapid cardiac enzyme panel, and the results indicate absolutely zero troponin elevation. There is no evidence of ischemia. There is no evidence of infarction." Brenda stopped weeping and stepped forward, her brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "Speak in plain English, doctor." My daughter collapsed. "It means Julian stated clearly, ensuring his voice carried down the hallway, that your daughter is physically fine. She is experiencing zero cardiac distress. Medically speaking, she is faking a panic attack." The silence that followed his statement was absolute. The background noise of the emergency department seemed to vanish. Brad stopped running his hand through his hair. Thomas stared at Julian, his jaw tightening as he processed the fact that a physician had just publicly dismantled their carefully constructed narrative. Through the glass window of the trauma bay behind Julian, I could clearly see Chloe lying on the stretcher. When Julian delivered his assessment, she visibly stiffened. She abandoned the weak, fluttering eyelids routine. She opened one eye, glared through the glass at the doctor who had just exposed her, and then quickly shut it again, realizing she was still on display. "How dare you speak to us with such disrespect?" Brenda gasped, her voice trembling with genuine outrage. She stepped closer to Julian, her finger pointing sharply at his chest. "You are an incompetent quack. You took a quick glance at a machine and decided my daughter is a liar. I will not tolerate this level of unprofessionalism. I will contact the hospital administration. I will have your medical license revoked." Julian did not flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, entirely unfazed by the threat. "You have no idea who you are dealing with." My mother continued, her volume escalating. "Do you know who my other daughter is? She is a powerful executive in this very building. She manages the operations for this entire network. When I tell her how you treated our family tonight, she will ensure you are fired before your shift ends." This was the moment. The exact intersection of my hidden sanctuary and their toxic reality. My mother was attempting to weaponize my professional success to destroy the career of a man who was simply doing his job. She believed my loyalty to the family name would force me to blindly execute her vengeance. She thought she held the ultimate trump card. Julian's smile widened. It was a slow, deliberate smile that radiated absolute confidence. He lowered his tablet, turned away from my furious parents, and walked directly toward me. The hallway watched as he crossed the distance. He stopped in front of me, reached out, and gently pulled me by the waist. He leaned down and kissed my cheek softly, right in front of Thomas and Brenda. It was an intimate, undeniable gesture of ownership and partnership. He turned back to face my parents, keeping his arms securely wrapped around my waist. "I know exactly who Amelia is," Julian said, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet corridor. "She is the Senior Vice President of Operations. She is an exceptional executive, and she is also my fiancé." I watched the realization strike my parents like a physical blow. Thomas took a step backward, his mouth opening, but producing no sound. Brenda's hand flew to her throat, her eyes darting frantically between Julian and me, trying to process the impossibility of the scene before her. The daughter they had dismissed, the woman they had tried to manipulate at dinner, was standing in a position of ultimate authority, deeply connected to the physician who had just humiliated them. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had completely inverted. Julian looked at his tablet one last time, tapping a button on the screen to finalize the chart. "As for your other daughter inside that room," he concluded briskly, "since she requires zero medical intervention, I have officially signed her release papers. We are discharging her immediately. I suggest you collect her and vacate the emergency department so my team can focus on patients who actually require our care." Julian handed the tablet to the charge nurse, squeezed my hand briefly, and walked back through the double doors toward the trauma bays, leaving my family stranded in the hallway. They were completely stripped of their leverage. Their grand performance had resulted in nothing but public exposure and a swift eviction from the premises. But as I watched them scramble to collect Chloe, I knew the embarrassment of this night would not force them into retreat. It would force them to find a different angle of attack. The Harrison family never accepted defeat gracefully. They only searched for hidden vulnerabilities to exploit, and I was about to discover they had already found one buried deep within the hospital's administrative billing system. The silence in that sterile corridor possessed a physical weight. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating, the last remnants of my family's grand illusion. My mother stood paralyzed. Her mouth formed a tight, bloodless line. The designer handbag she had been clutching like a shield slowly slid down to her side, her knuckles stark white against the leather. My father, a man whose entire identity revolved around dictating the reality of everyone in his orbit, stared at me as if I had just materialized from thin air. He could not process the scene. The hierarchy he had spent decades enforcing had just shattered on a linoleum floor. I watched the realization wash over Thomas. The crimson flush that had started at his collar crept upward, painting his cheeks with a toxic mix of embarrassment and fury. He had come here to leverage a crisis. He had intended to use my workplace as a theater for his dominance. Instead, he found himself stripped of all authority, outranked by the very daughter he considered subservient, and outmaneuvered by the physician he had tried to bully. Julian stood firmly by my side. His presence offered a steady grounding force, but he did not speak again. He did not need to. He had delivered the medical verdict and established our partnership. The rest of this battle belonged to me. Inside the trauma bay, the muffled sounds of medical equipment beeped in a steady, monotonous rhythm. The glass partition provided a clear view of the stretcher. Chloe had been listening. The moment she realized the performance had failed, the miraculous recovery commenced. There was no groggy awakening. There was no lingering chest pain or disorientation. My sister sat up with the sudden sharp energy of a coiled spring snapping loose. She ripped the pulse oximeter off her index finger and threw it onto the mattress. She swung her legs over the side of the hospital bed, her bare feet hitting the floor with a loud slap. The dying woman from the steakhouse vanished instantly, replaced by a vindictive, enraged antagonist. She stormed out of the trauma bay, pushing past a bewildered charge nurse. Her hair was slightly disheveled from her theatrical fall, but her strides were purposeful and aggressive. She marched directly up to Julian, pointing a manicured finger mere inches from his face. "You are a terrible doctor!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the acoustic ceiling tiles. "You barely even examined me. I experienced heart palpitations. I could have died, and you are standing out here fraternizing. I will sue you for malpractice. I will make sure you never practice medicine in this state again." Her outburst served as the perfect unintended validation of Julian's diagnosis. A patient suffering a genuine cardiac event does not leap from a bed to scream legal threats at an attending physician. They do not possess the lung capacity or the physical stamina for such a display. By trying to assert her dominance, Chloe merely proved her own deception. This was a familiar tactic. When we were teenagers, Chloe feigned a severe migraine on the morning of my senior prom, forcing our parents to spend the entire day catering to her demands. They refused to take my photos or help me prepare, leaving me to drive myself to the dance alone. When I returned that night, her fever had miraculously vanished, and she was cheerfully watching television in the living room. Illness was her favorite weapon whenever my life dared to take center stage. But tonight, that weapon had been rendered entirely useless. Seeing Chloe standing upright and screaming provided my father with a new avenue of attack. He realized the medical manipulation had failed, so he pivoted immediately to the next available grievance. He ignored his supposedly fragile daughter and turned his wrath entirely on me. "You are marrying him," Thomas sputtered, gesturing wildly between Julian and me. "You get engaged to some arrogant doctor, and you hide it from your own parents. We had to find out in a hospital hallway from a stranger. What kind of deceitful, sneaking behavior is this? You have no respect for this family." He stepped closer, attempting to tower over me. He expected me to shrink. He expected the ingrained conditioning of my childhood to kick in, forcing me to apologize, to smooth things over, to absorb his anger, so the family could return to its toxic equilibrium. I looked at the three of them. I saw the architects of my childhood misery. I saw the mother who viewed me as a bargaining chip, the sister who viewed me as a threat, and the father who viewed me as property. Standing there illuminated by harsh overhead lights, they did not look powerful. They looked desperate. They looked small. I felt a profound peace settle into my bones. My heartbeat did not elevate. My palms did not sweat. "I did not tell you because you ruin everything you touch," I said. The words were spoken evenly. I did not yell. I did not infuse my tone with malice or venom. I delivered the truth with the detached clarity of an executive stating a factual metric. "You do not celebrate my victories," I continued, holding my father's gaze. "You exploit them. If I had brought Julian to your house, Chloe would have manufactured a crisis to ruin the evening. You would have interrogated him about his salary. Mom would have tried to plan a wedding that functioned solely as a networking event for her social circle. I kept this a secret because it is precious to me, and you do not get to contaminate the things I value." Brenda gasped, clutching her chest, as if she might try to steal Chloe's discarded heart attack routine. "You ungrateful girl," she wailed. "We drove all the way here because we thought your sister was in peril. We are trying to protect each other. Since you brought up protection, I suggest you head toward the billing department," I replied smoothly. "Let us discuss the financial logistics of tonight's performance." I shifted my attention back to Chloe, who was glaring at me with unbridled hatred. "When you are admitted to an emergency room for a life-threatening condition, insurance covers the costs," I explained. "But you are not experiencing a medical emergency. You are a healthy woman who commandeered an ambulance and occupied a premium trauma bed to throw a temper tantrum." I gestured down the hall toward the administrative desks. "Our hospital network has very strict protocols regarding fraudulent admissions. Because Julian officially documented this as a non-emergency discharge, your insurance provider will automatically deny the claim for the transport and the facility fee. They consider it an elective misuse of resources. That means the $3,500 bill is entirely out of pocket. It is due upon discharge. You can pay it at the front desk before you leave." The color drained from Brad's face. He had been lurking in the background, but the mention of a massive, uninsurable expense snapped him to attention. $3,500, he choked out. "We do not have that kind of money right now." "Amelia, you work here. You can waive the fee." I smiled a tight, professional expression. "I do not override federal billing compliance for anyone, Brad, especially not for theatrical performances." I turned to Julian. "We have a dinner to finish at home." Julian nodded, taking my hand. We turned our backs on them and walked down the corridor. Behind us, the shouts echoed against the tile walls. Thomas was bellowing at a nearby security guard, demanding to see a manager. Brenda was weeping. Chloe was screeching that she would refuse to pay. I did not look back. I let the heavy doors of the administrative wing close behind us, sealing their chaos out of my life. I have to pause the story right here for a moment. Have you ever had a toxic family member fake an illness or manufacture a massive crisis just to steal your joy? Have you ever experienced a milestone, a wedding, a graduation, or a promotion, only to have a narcissistic sibling suddenly demand all the attention in the room? If you have ever dealt with someone who could not stand seeing you succeed, drop a yes in the comments below. I know I am not the only one who has survived this kind of manipulation. And if you want to know how this fake hospital trip uncovered a massive criminal conspiracy, you need to hit subscribe to Orange Revenge. Because leaving them with that emergency room bill was satisfying, but the real betrayal was still hiding quietly in the hospital paperwork. The discovery I made the following week would change my life forever. Walking away from my family in that hospital corridor felt like closing a heavy, rusted door that had been swinging wildly in the wind for 32 years. I truly believed that stranding them with a massive, uninsurable emergency room bill would serve as the final punctuation mark on our relationship. I assumed the financial sting would force them to retreat back to Paradise Valley and lick their wounds. I expected a period of angry silence, perhaps a few passive-aggressive Facebook posts from my mother about ungrateful children abandoning their families. I was prepared for that. I was not prepared for what they had actually been planning. A week passed. The chaos of that Friday night settled, and I immersed myself fully in my new role as Senior Vice President of Operations. My office was located on the top floor of the administrative tower, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Camelback Mountains. The desert landscape was stark and beautiful, a constant reminder of clarity and endurance. It was a Tuesday morning. I was reviewing the quarterly budget projections for the surgical departments when a sharp knock sounded at my door. "Come in," I called out, not looking up from my monitor. The heavy mahogany door swung open. Sarah, the hospital network's director of billing and compliance, stepped into the room. Sarah was a meticulous, sharp-eyed professional who had worked in hospital administration for 20 years. She was the kind of person who noticed a misplaced decimal point on a 50-page spreadsheet. She did not typically visit executive offices unless there was a significant systemic issue. "Amelia, do you have a moment?" she asked, closing the door firmly behind her. Her tone was strictly professional, but there was a distinct edge of concern tight in her voice. I set down my pen and gave her my full attention. "What do you need, Sarah?" She walked over to my desk and placed a thick manila file folder directly in front of me. "We have a red flag on a high-tier insurance pre-authorization," she explained, taking a seat in one of the leather guest chairs. "The automated compliance system flagged it for secondary review late last night. Given the specifics of the file, I felt it was necessary to bring it directly to you, rather than routing it through the standard audit chain." I opened the folder. The top sheet was a standard insurance pre-authorization request form, the kind submitted to secure funding before major medical procedures. As a senior VP, my compensation package included a premium executive healthcare plan. It was a robust policy designed to offer comprehensive coverage, and it included a specific rider that allowed me to extend coverage to immediate family members acting as dependents in cases of extreme medical necessity or catastrophic trauma. It was a safety net designed for genuine tragedies. I began scanning the document. The patient listed was Chloe Harrison. My pulse stuttered. I leaned closer to the paperwork, tracing the lines of data with my index finger. The requested procedure was extensive. It outlined a multi-stage operation scheduled to take place at our network's specialized cosmetic and reconstructive surgery pavilion. The billing codes were complex, but I recognized them instantly. They detailed a full abdominoplasty, a breast lift with augmentation and extensive liposuction. In layman's terms, Chloe had scheduled a comprehensive mommy makeover. The total estimated cost listed at the bottom of the page was $45,000. That was infuriating, but it was not illegal to seek a consultation. The illegality surfaced when I looked at the justification codes. The procedure was not being billed as elective cosmetic surgery. It was being fraudulently coded as reconstructive trauma surgery, claiming the operations were medically necessary to repair severe abdominal muscle separation and tissue damage resulting from a prior undocumented accident. I looked up at Sarah. "My sister is not a dependent on my plan," I stated, my voice dangerously calm. "And she certainly has not suffered any trauma requiring $45,000 of reconstructive surgery. Why did this even reach the pre-authorization stage?" Sarah reached across the desk and flipped to the third page of the file. "That is the red flag, Amelia. Look at the financial guarantor section." I stared at the page. At the bottom, designated in the space required to authorize the extension of my premium executive benefits to a dependent, was my signature. It was a digital e-signature cleanly executed and time-stamped from 3 days prior. Below the signature line, the form listed my full legal name, my specific executive employee identification number, and the last 4 digits of my Social Security number. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Someone had forged my authorization. They had stolen my professional credentials and utilized my most sensitive personal data to approve a massive fraudulent payout. I did not sign this, I whispered, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of the violation. Sarah nodded grimly. I suspected as much. When the system flagged the unusually high cost associated with a dependent addition, my team pulled the digital audit trail. We tracked the origin of every remote signature for compliance purposes. She tapped a highlighted line of text at the very bottom of the document. That is the IP address and the geolocation data from the device used to submit the electronic signature. I recognized the geolocation coordinates instantly. It mapped directly to a residential address in Paradise Valley, my parents' house. The pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. The dinner at the steakhouse, the demand to hire Brad as a consultant, the fake heart attack. They had never intended to rely solely on my guilt. They were executing a multi-layered extraction strategy. When I refused to hand Brad a fake salary, and when Julian ruined their plan to extort the restaurant over a fabricated medical emergency, they activated their contingency plan. They decided to bypass my consent entirely. My father Thomas handled all the administrative paperwork for my family. He was a man who believed rules applied to everyone except him. He had always kept meticulous files on all of us. He possessed my Social Security number from old tax returns. He had likely memorized my executive ID number from an old piece of mail, or by calling Human Resources pretending to verify my employment details. He had logged onto the hospital network's patient portal posed as me and digitally signed a legally binding document guaranteeing payment for Chloe's luxury plastic surgery. He assumed my new position as senior VP would act as a shield. He thought the billing department would see my name, see my title, and simply push the paperwork through without questioning a powerful executive. He believed his theft would remain buried under a mountain of bureaucratic red tape. He was wrong. He had not just crossed a boundary. He had crossed a legal line into federal territory. By forging my identity to authorize a medical procedure under false pretenses, Thomas Harrison had just committed felony insurance fraud. Furthermore, by using my Social Security number to execute the scheme, he was guilty of aggravated identity theft. Sarah watched me process the information. "We can halt the pre-authorization immediately," she offered quietly. "We can quietly cancel the procedure and flag the patient profile to prevent future submissions. We can handle this internally if that is what you prefer." She was offering me a professional courtesy. She was giving me the option to sweep my family's criminality under the rug to protect myself from the embarrassment of a public scandal. It was the easy way out. It was the path my mother would have demanded I take to protect the family name. For a fraction of a second, I thought about the fallout. I thought about the whispering among the hospital board. I thought about the sheer exhaustion of engaging in a legal battle with the people who raised me. But then I looked at the forged signature. I saw the ultimate manifestation of their entitlement. They did not view me as a daughter. They viewed me as an asset to be plundered. They believed they were entitled to my hard work, my reputation, and my financial security simply because we shared DNA. If I canceled this quietly, they would try again. They would open credit cards in my name. They would take out loans. The theft would never stop until I stopped them. "No," I told Sarah, closing the file folder. "We are not handling this internally." Sarah raised her eyebrows. "Are you certain?" I picked up the folder and stood up from my desk. "I am certain. I want you to initiate a full compliance lock on this file. Print the digital audit logs, the IP tracking data, and the falsified medical justification codes. Compile everything into an official incident report." I walked around my desk, the reality of my next steps solidifying into cold, unbreakable determination. "I will be taking this file directly to the hospital's legal counsel," I continued, "and then I am going to submit a formal report to the Arizona Department of Insurance Fraud." Sarah stood up, a look of profound respect crossing her features. "It will trigger a state investigation, Amelia. It will involve law enforcement." "I know," I replied. "They used my name to commit a felony. I am not going to protect them from the consequences of their own arrogance." I thanked Sarah and asked her to prepare the physical documents. As she left my office, I turned back to the window, looking out over the mountains. The desert does not forgive weakness. It demands resilience. My family had mistaken my previous silence for submission. They thought my success made me a lucrative target. They were about to discover that my success provided me with the resources, the knowledge, and the absolute authority to dismantle their lives completely and legally. I did not call my parents screaming. I did not send an angry text message demanding an explanation. I am a healthcare executive. I deal in audits, evidence, and compliance. I was going to gather every piece of undeniable proof, and I was going to deliver the reckoning in person. I was going back to Paradise Valley, and I was bringing the bureaucratic guillotine with me. I did not call my parents screaming. That was the response they expected. They anticipated a hysterical phone call full of tears and accusations, an emotional outburst they could easily dismiss as the dramatic overreaction of an ungrateful daughter. The Harrison family operated entirely on emotion and chaos. They thrived when the waters were muddy and the facts could be manipulated. I was not going to give them that satisfaction. I am a healthcare executive. My entire career is built on mitigating risk, ensuring regulatory compliance, and executing flawless audits. I deal in hard data, verifiable metrics, and undeniable proof. When you discover your own family has committed a felony using your identity, you do not throw a tantrum. You build a case. I spent the next 48 hours compiling the evidence. Working alongside Sarah and the IT security department, I gathered every digital footprint my father had clumsily left behind in the hospital's administrative portal. I printed the forged PDF documents containing my falsified signature. I secured the time-stamped metadata that proved exactly when the forms were submitted. I obtained the certified IP logs that traced the fraudulent access directly to the router at my parents' residence in Paradise Valley. I even included a certified copy of the emergency room intake form from the night of Chloe's theatrical performance, documenting Julian's official assessment that she required zero medical intervention. I arranged the documents meticulously inside a standard manila folder. I placed the most damning evidence at the very front. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for interpretation or denial. It was a complete, irrefutable paper trail detailing a massive insurance fraud scheme. On Saturday morning, I dressed in a simple tailored navy suit. I did not want to appear casual. I wanted to look exactly like the executive they had tried to exploit. I left my townhouse and drove across town toward Paradise Valley. The weather was perfect, the kind of clear, bright Arizona morning that makes the desert feel vibrant and alive. The contrast between the beautiful day and the reckoning I was carrying in the passenger seat was stark. I pulled into the expansive circular driveway of my parents' home. It was a sprawling Mediterranean-style estate they had purchased years ago, long before Thomas's investments began to sour and Brenda's spending habits started catching up to them. They maintained the facade of wealth brilliantly. The landscaping was immaculate. The water in the large fountain near the entrance bubbled cheerfully. I did not knock. I still possessed my key, a relic from a time when I foolishly believed this house was a safe harbor. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the foyer. The house was quiet, but I could hear the faint sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifting in from the backyard. I walked through the formal living room, past the grand piano. No one played, and pushed open the sliding glass doors that led to the expansive outdoor patio. The scene before me was a portrait of arrogant entitlement. Chloe. Brad Thomas and Brenda were lounging around the pristine swimming pool. They were seated at the wrought iron patio table beneath a large canvas umbrella, enjoying a late morning brunch. A silver ice bucket holding a bottle of expensive champagne sat in the center of the table alongside a carafe of orange juice. They were drinking mimosas. They were laughing. They were actively celebrating what they believed was a flawless financial hack. They thought they had successfully outsmarted the system and secured a $45,000 payout at my expense. My arrival interrupted their celebration. The laughter died instantly. Thomas lowered his crystal flute and stared at me. He did not look surprised to see me, merely annoyed that I had arrived unannounced. He assumed I was there to beg for forgiveness after the disastrous incident at the steakhouse. He believed his silence over the past week had adequately punished me. "Well," my father sneered, leaning back in his cushioned patio chair and crossing his arms, "are you here to apologize for your arrogant fiancé? Or did you finally realize how disgracefully you treated your sister and decide to make amends?" I did not raise my voice. I did not match his aggressive energy. I walked calmly toward the patio table. I held the manila folder in my right hand. "I am not here to apologize, Dad," I stated clearly. I stopped at the edge of the table. I looked at each of them. Chloe wearing oversized sunglasses and a designer swimsuit looking supremely bored. Brad checking his phone completely detached from the tension. Brenda adjusting the collar of her silk cover-up, preparing to launch into a lecture about family loyalty. I lifted the manila folder and tossed it onto the center of the glass table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thwack right next to the champagne bucket. "I know about the $45,000 forged pre-authorization," I said. The reaction was instantaneous. The bored, arrogant expressions vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. The color drained completely from Thomas's face, leaving his skin an ashy, sickly gray. He stared at the folder as if it were a live, explosive device. His mouth opened slightly, but the confident patriarch who had just demanded an apology was gone. He could not form a single word. Chloe jerked backward in her chair. Her hand hit her champagne flute, knocking it over. The mimosa spilled across the glass table, dripping onto the pristine pool deck, but no one moved to clean it up. She pulled down her sunglasses, her eyes wide with terror. "What are you talking about?" Brenda stammered, her voice pitching high and thin. She reached out tentatively toward the folder but pulled her hand back before touching it. "What is this, Amelia?" "It is the complete digital audit trail." I explained, my tone remaining clinical and detached. "It contains the insurance documents submitted to my hospital network requesting a full cosmetic reconstructive surgery for Chloe. It also contains the financial guarantor forms where you..." Dad forged my electronic signature, utilized my executive identification number, and inputted my social security number to illegally secure premium coverage. I pointed to the folder. The final pages are the IP tracking logs. They prove the fraudulent signature was executed from the router inside this very house. Brad jumped up from his chair, nearly knocking it backward into the pool. "You tracked the IP address?" He croaked, his voice cracking. He looked at Thomas with wild, accusing eyes. "You said this was foolproof. You said her executive status would bypass the security checks. You promised no one would look closely at the paperwork." "Shut up, Brad," Thomas hissed, finding his voice at last. He glared at his son-in-law, panic leaking through his anger. He turned back to me, attempting to salvage the situation with bluster. "Amelia, you are blowing this completely out of proportion. It is just administrative paperwork. I was navigating a complex insurance loophole to get your sister the care she needs. Families help each other navigate these systems all the time." "It is not a loophole, Dad," I corrected him sharply. "It is identity theft. And billing a mommy makeover as trauma reconstruction is insurance fraud. Both are felony offenses." Chloe erupted. She sprang from her chair, her face contorted with rage and desperation. "I am your sister," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You have premium executive insurance. You have millions of dollars of coverage sitting there doing nothing. You owe me this. You owe me after humiliating me in the emergency room and refusing to help my husband. We are family. You are supposed to share your resources. You do not get to steal my identity because you feel entitled to a free tummy tuck," Chloe, I replied coldly. "You do not get to commit federal crimes and call it sharing." Brenda stood up, her entire body shaking. She recognized the severity of the situation. She knew that screaming and demands would not work against hard evidence. She pivoted to the only tactic she had left. She attempted to manipulate my sense of duty. "Amelia, please." My mother pleaded, her eyes welling with manufactured tears. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest. "This is a misunderstanding. Your father made a poor judgment call because he was worried about his family. We are under so much stress right now. You cannot do this to us. You cannot ruin your father's life over a mistake." She took a step toward me, reaching out as if to take my hand. I stepped back, refusing the contact. "Cancel the investigation, Amelia." Brenda begged, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Just go back to your office on Monday, tell them it was an administrative error, and withdraw the file. We will never ask you for anything again. I promise. We can fix this quietly. It is just family helping family." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life prioritizing my sister's comfort over my basic needs. I looked at the father who believed he owned me. I looked at the sister who believed my success existed solely to fund her vanity. They were not sorry they had committed a crime. They were only terrified they had been caught. "I cannot cancel it, Mom," I said, delivering the final blow with absolute precision. Brenda froze. "What do you mean you cannot cancel it? You are the senior vice president. You are in charge. I am in charge of operations, I clarified. I am not in charge of shielding felons from the law. I did not just flag this in our internal system. I cannot withdraw the paperwork because it is no longer in my possession." I looked directly at Thomas, ensuring he understood the magnitude of his destruction. I handed the entire file, the IP logs, the forged documents, the time-stamped metadata to the hospital's legal department yesterday afternoon. By policy, they are required to report it. They have already forwarded the complete dossier to the Arizona Department of Insurance Fraud and the State Attorney General's office. Thomas staggered backward, his legs hitting the edge of a sun lounger. He collapsed onto the cushions, his face buried in his hands. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat. "It is out of my hands," I concluded, turning away from the patio table. I walked back through the sliding glass doors, leaving the folder resting next to the spilled mimosa. I did not wait for their screams. I did not wait for their curses or their pleas. The truth was out. The trap they built for themselves had sprung shut, and the bureaucratic machinery they tried to exploit was now actively hunting them. But as I drove away from Paradise Valley, I knew the Harrison family would not surrender to the authorities quietly. Desperation breeds viciousness. They were backed into a corner, facing financial ruin and potential prison time. They could not fight the state investigators, so they would inevitably turn their remaining ammunition entirely on me. They would try to destroy my reputation before the law could destroy theirs, and they were about to launch a smear campaign that would reveal a secondary, far more sinister motive behind their desperation. The fallout from my visit to Paradise Valley was immediate. When you back narcissistic individuals into a corner, they do not reflect on their actions or express genuine remorse. They attack. They lash out with whatever weapons they have available, attempting to rewrite the narrative to position themselves as the victims. My family had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of the smear campaign. Now facing federal investigation and potential prison time, they launched a coordinated assault against my character. They went on the offensive within hours. Brenda was the orchestrator of their public relations strategy. She recognized that the legal facts were entirely against them, so she sought to win in the court of public opinion. She took to Facebook that very evening. She did not mention the forged signatures. She did not mention the $45,000 cosmetic procedure or the IP logs. Instead, she drafted long theatrical paragraphs filled with capitalized words and excessive exclamation points. "It breaks a mother's heart to see what money does to her children," the post began. "Our youngest daughter, Amelia, recently received a promotion and has transformed into an abusive, power-hungry executive. She is currently using her authority at the hospital to deliberately withhold life-saving medical care from her older sister, Chloe, who is suffering terribly. We are exploring all our legal options to protect our family from this cruelty. Please keep us in your prayers." The post was a masterpiece of manipulation. It portrayed me as a cartoonish villain, a corrupt executive denying critical health care to a vulnerable sibling. It was entirely false, but it achieved its intended effect. The extended Harrison family, a sprawling network of aunts, uncles, and cousins who only engaged with us during holidays and funerals, immediately rallied to Brenda's defense. They did not call to ask for my side of the story. They simply believed the narrative presented to them. My phone began buzzing incessantly by Sunday morning. The text messages flooded in a barrage of condemnation from people I barely knew. My Aunt Diane wrote, "How can you be so heartless? Your sister needs help, and you are playing power games." My cousin Greg sent a message calling me a sociopath. Uncle Richard left a furious voicemail demanding I resign from my position in disgrace before he drove to Phoenix to handle me himself. I read the messages and listened to the voicemails with a strange, detached calm. 10 years ago, this level of unified family rejection would have crushed me. I would have drafted lengthy replies desperately trying to explain the truth, begging them to look at the evidence. I would have apologized for causing distress even though I was the victim. But I was no longer that frightened girl. I was a senior vice president who had just handed an ironclad fraud case to the state investigators. I knew the extended family was defending criminals. I simply blocked their numbers one by one. I did not engage. I did not defend myself. I let the silence protect my peace. But my family's flailing was indicative of a much deeper panic. The Facebook posts and angry text messages were a smokescreen, a desperate attempt to create noise to distract from the reality of their situation. They were drowning. And 2 nights later, the true depth of their desperation arrived on my doorstep. It was a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my living room, reviewing preliminary architectural plans for a new outpatient clinic my hospital network was developing. Julian was working a late shift in the ER. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. The doorbell rang at 9:30. It was not a polite knock. It was a frantic, erratic hammering against the wood. I checked the security camera feed on my phone. Brad was standing on my front porch. He looked unraveled. He was pacing back and forth, dragging his hands through his uncombed hair. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt that was untucked on one side, and he appeared to be muttering to himself. I hesitated. Engaging with Brad was always a risk, but curiosity overrode my caution. I needed to know why he had come here alone without Chloe pulling his strings. I unlocked the deadbolt, leaving the security chain engaged, and opened the door a few inches. The stench hit me immediately. Brad smelled strongly of cheap Scotch stale sweat and sheer unfiltered panic. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands were trembling as he gripped the doorframe. "Amelia," he gasped, his words slurring slightly. "Please, you have to let me in. You have to talk to me." I kept the door partially closed. "You should not be here, Brad. We have nothing to discuss. The investigators will contact you soon enough." He pressed his face closer to the gap in the doorway. "You do not understand. You do not know what is actually happening. We are going to lose everything." Chloe is inside the house screaming. Thomas is refusing to answer his phone. They left me to deal with the fallout. He leaned his forehead against the wooden frame, looking pathetic and entirely broken. "Amelia, you have to drop the charges. Tell the legal department it was a mix-up. Tell them I did it by accident. I will take the blame for an administrative error. But you cannot let the fraud investigators proceed." I stared at him, marveling at his delusion. "Brad," I stated firmly, "you cannot accidentally forge a digital signature and input a Social Security number to authorize $45,000 of elective surgery. It is a targeted felony. I cannot stop the investigation. It is in the hands of the state." Brad let out a ragged, desperate sob. He gripped the edge of the door, his knuckles turning white. "You do not get it," he cried. The surgery was not just about the surgery, it was the payout. We needed the recovery payout. I frowned, confused by his phrasing. "What recovery payout? What are you talking about?" The Scotch had loosened his tongue, eroding whatever filter remained of his self-preservation. The panic broke the dam, and the truth came spilling out in a rushing, chaotic confession. "We are $150,000 in debt," Amelia Brad blurted out, his eyes wide and wild. "My last 2 business ventures completely tanked. We have 2nd and 3rd mortgages on the house. The bank sent a foreclosure notice last month. We are drowning." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "When you got that promotion, Thomas said it was our way out. He said your new salary and your executive insurance could save us. The plan at the steakhouse was brilliant. Chloe was going to fake the heart attack. We were going to sue the restaurant for emotional distress and negligence, claiming their environment triggered a severe medical crisis. We researched it. Restaurants settle those claims quickly to avoid bad press. We thought we could easily get $50,000. He let out a bitter, drunken laugh. "But then your fiancé ruined it. He discharged her. He documented that she was faking. He destroyed our leverage against the restaurant." I listened, horrified by the sheer depth of their depravity. They had not just faked a medical emergency for attention. They had staged it as a calculated extortion plot. And when Julian neutralized that threat, they pivoted to a more direct form of theft. So the surgery was the backup plan. I said the pieces locking into place. Brad nodded frantically. "Thomas found the loophole in your executive policy regarding trauma reconstruction. If we billed the mommy makeover as a necessary trauma procedure, your insurance would cover the $45,000 cost. But the clinic we chose also offered a comprehensive post-operative recovery package, extended hotel stays, specialized nursing care, meal stipends. We were going to claim the maximum recovery allowance, submit fraudulent receipts, and pocket the cash difference. It would have generated enough liquid capital to stall the bank foreclosure for another 6 months. He looked at me with pleading, bloodshot eyes. We needed the money, Amelia. We were desperate. You have a massive salary now. You do not need the money. We do. I stood on my porch looking at the man my sister had married. He was attempting to justify grand larceny and extortion by blaming his own financial incompetence on my success. They had weaponized my promotion. They had not viewed my achievement as a milestone to celebrate. They viewed it as a literal piggy bank, a mechanism they could crack open and drain to fund their criminal fraud. My parents and my sister were not just toxic, entitled individuals. They were a sinking ship, a vessel taking on water fast, and they had actively tried to chain me to the mast to pull me down with them. They were willing to destroy my professional reputation, compromise my executive standing, and implicate me in federal insurance fraud just to buy themselves 6 more months in a house they could not afford. I looked at Brad. I felt no pity. I felt no residual family loyalty. I saw a criminal standing on my doorstep, begging me to protect him from the consequences of his own theft. Brad, I said, my voice cold and unwavering, you tried to extort a restaurant. You conspired to steal my identity. You committed felony fraud to fund a lavish lifestyle you cannot afford. And now you are standing here demanding I risk my freedom to save you from ruin. I reached for the door handle. I am not your safety net, I told him, and I am not going down with your ship. You and Chloe are going to face the investigators, and you are going to pay for exactly what you did. Do not ever come to my home again. I pushed the heavy door forward. Brad stepped back, his mouth opening in a silent protest. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud, satisfying snap. I slid the security chain across the track and watched through the peephole as Brad stumbled down my driveway, disappearing into the dark street. The truth was entirely exposed. The motives were laid bare. The Harrison family's facade of wealth and superiority had crumbled, revealing the desperate criminal reality beneath. But my family was not finished. Their attempts at manipulation and private begging had failed. The Facebook smear campaign had failed to force my compliance. They realized they could not win a silent war, so they decided to launch a highly public, explosive confrontation. They were going to leverage the most important professional event of my career to stage their final desperate stand, unaware that they were walking directly into a trap that would result in handcuffs. The confrontation on my porch clarified the situation completely. I was no longer dealing with a family dispute over boundaries or favoritism. I was dealing with individuals who operated with a criminal mindset driven entirely by financial desperation. When people face the collapse of their fabricated lives, they rarely retreat quietly. They escalate. The Harrison family had exhausted their private avenues of intimidation. Their social media smear campaigns had failed to secure my compliance. Brad's drunken confession confirmed they were out of options and out of time. They needed a public stage, a venue where the pressure of exposure would force me to capitulate. They found their perfect opportunity 3 weeks later. Every October, our hospital network hosted an exclusive charity gala. The event was held at a prestigious luxury resort, nestled among the striking red rock formations of Sedona. It was the premier gathering for Arizona's medical elite, drawing chief surgeons, wealthy benefactors, hospital board members, and prominent local politicians. Tickets cost $2,000 a plate. Security was tight, and the guest list was meticulously curated. This year, the stakes were exceptionally high for me. The board had selected me to deliver the keynote address. It was my official introduction to the philanthropic community as the new Senior Vice President of Operations. The speech required me to present the network's strategic vision for the upcoming fiscal year. My reputation, my authority, and my future trajectory within the organization rested on the execution of this evening. My family knew this. Thomas always kept track of the hospital's major public events, previously viewing them as opportunities to network with wealthy doctors. He recognized that causing a scene at the Sedona Gala would threaten the very foundation of my career. He calculated that the sheer terror of public humiliation in front of the hospital board would finally force me to drop the fraud investigation. I anticipated their arrival. When you understand how narcissists strategize their movements, become remarkably predictable. I knew they would attempt to crash the event. I just did not inform them that I was fully prepared for their ambush. Julian and I arrived at the resort late Friday afternoon. I wore a tailored emerald green evening gown. Julian wore a classic black tuxedo. We mingled during the preliminary cocktail hour, held on an expansive outdoor terrace overlooking the canyon. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the sandstone cliffs. Waiters circulated with silver trays holding champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere was refined, affluent, and heavily insulated from the chaos of the outside world. I was engaged in a quiet conversation with the chairman of the hospital board when the disruption began. The heavy mahogany doors leading from the resort lobby to the terrace swung open violently. The sudden movement drew the attention of nearby guests. Thomas, Brenda, and Chloe marched onto the terrace. They had clearly coordinated their appearance to project an image of outraged dignity. Thomas wore a rented tuxedo that did not quite fit his shoulders. Brenda wore a sequined gown, her face set in a mask of rigid indignation. Chloe trailed behind them, her expression a toxic mixture of panic and malice. Brad was notably absent, presumably hiding from the impending collision. They bypassed the registration table, ignoring the attempts of a young event coordinator to verify their invitations. Thomas possessed the kind of aggressive entitlement that often paralyzed service staff. He spotted me immediately near the VIP curtain and made a direct, unswerving path through the crowd. Conversations died down as they approached. Wealthy donors and prominent surgeons paused mid-sentence, observing the aggressive energy radiating from my father. Amelia Thomas barked, his voice carrying clearly across the terrace. He did not bother with pleasantries or lowered tones. He wanted an audience. He wanted leverage. I excused myself from the chairman and turned to face my family. I did not step backward. I held my ground, my posture relaxed but commanding. Julian moved to stand beside me, a silent, immovable presence. "Dad," I said calmly, keeping my voice modulated to a professional volume. "This is a private ticketed charity event. You are not on the guest list. You need to leave immediately." "I am not leaving until you fix what you have done," Thomas demanded, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. He took another step forward, attempting to utilize his physical size to intimidate me. "You have lost your mind, Amelia. You are destroying your sister's life over a minor paperwork error. You are trying to send your own father to prison because you are too arrogant to help your family." Brenda chimed in, her voice shrill and theatrical, perfectly pitched to reach the ears of the surrounding executives. "You have become a monster," she cried, clutching her beaded evening bag. "We raised you. We sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us, by filing false police reports, by withholding medical care from Chloe." Chloe sneered, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Everyone here needs to know what kind of sociopath they just promoted. You think you are so powerful, but you are just a vindictive little girl trying to ruin us because you are jealous." The strategy was obvious. They were employing the scorched earth tactic. They intended to create a scene so loud, so embarrassing, and so fundamentally damaging to my professional image that I would agree to any demand just to make them stop. They expected me to panic, to pull them into a private room, to promise I would call the investigators and retract my statements. "You are going to call the lawyers right now," Thomas threatened, leaning in close, his face flushed with rage. "You are going to tell them you authorized the procedure. You are going to withdraw the fraud report. If you refuse, I will stand on this terrace and tell this entire room exactly what kind of heartless, manipulative monster you really are. I will ensure the board strips you of your title tonight." I looked at the three of them. I looked at the father who tried to steal my identity, the mother who enabled his crimes, and the sister who believed my career existed solely to fund her vanity. They had brought their toxic circus to the pinnacle of my professional life, fully expecting me to crumble. I did not flinch. I did not bargain. I simply smiled. It was a cold, decisive smile. "You can tell them yourself, Dad," I replied, my voice carrying the steady, lethal calm of an executive closing a trap. I gestured toward the heavy velvet VIP curtain located just a few feet away. Throughout the entire confrontation, two men had been standing quietly in the shadows near the draped fabric, observing the exchange. At my signal, they stepped forward into the soft evening light. The first man was David Sterling, the hospital network's lead corporate counsel. The second man wore a plain dark suit. He possessed a serious, unyielding demeanor that instantly neutralized my father's bluster. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge. "I am Detective Miller with the Arizona Attorney General's Office Financial Crimes Division," the man announced, his voice projecting clearly over the stunned silence of the terrace. The color drained instantly from Thomas's face. The aggressive pointing finger dropped to his side. The blustering patriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified man realizing he had just walked into a sophisticated ambush. Brenda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Chloe took a rapid step backward, her bravado evaporating entirely. "Mr. Harrison." Detective Miller continued, stepping squarely into Thomas's personal space. "We have been reviewing the evidence provided by the hospital's legal department regarding the forged insurance pre-authorizations. However, our investigation did not stop there. When a suspect utilizes a stolen Social Security number to commit medical insurance fraud, we routinely run a comprehensive audit on the victim's financial history." The detective paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over my family. The twist that my father had not anticipated was that forensic accountants are thorough. When they began digging into the digital trail of my Social Security number, they uncovered a much older, deeper crime. "We discovered a significant discrepancy dating back 2 years. The detective stated, his gaze locked on my father. "We found a $75,000 revolving line of credit opened with a national bank. The account was established using Amelia Harrison's Social Security number, but the funds were routed directly to a corporate shell account linked to your name, Mr. Harrison." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at my father. 2 years ago. Thomas had not just forged my medical documents last month. He had been actively stealing my financial identity for years. He had taken out a massive fraudulent loan using my pristine credit score, likely to cover Brad's failing businesses or to maintain the illusion of his own wealth. He had secretly saddled me with $75,000 of debt, and I had been completely unaware. The medical fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. The investigation had unearthed the hidden ruin of his entire financial existence. Thomas opened his mouth, stammering incoherently. "I did not. That was a business loan. I was going to pay it back. It was a bridge loan for the family." "That is not how the law works," Sir Detective Miller replied flatly. He reached behind his back and produced a pair of steel handcuffs. "Thomas Harrison, you are under arrest for multiple counts of felony identity theft, bank fraud, and insurance fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The loud metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed across the terrace. It was a sharp, definitive sound that signaled the absolute destruction of the Harrison family facade. Right there in front of the elite of Arizona's medical community, in front of the hospital board members he had hoped to impress, and in front of the daughter he had continually underestimated, my father was arrested. Brenda began to wail a high-pitched, genuine cry of despair as the detective turned Thomas around and began reading him his Miranda rights. Chloe stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock, as she watched her father, the man who had enabled her entitlement for 3 decades, being escorted away in disgrace. The lead corporate counsel, David Sterling, stepped forward and addressed my mother and sister. "You are trespassing on a private corporate event. You need to leave the premises immediately, or security will assist you in vacating the property." Brenda looked at me. Her mascara was running. Her carefully constructed image of high society superiority was shattered. "Amelia, please," she sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand. "You have to help him. You cannot let them take him away." I looked at the woman who had demanded I sacrifice my home, my career, and my peace of mind for a sister who despised me. I looked at the mother who had conspired to steal my identity and weaponize my success. I did not take her hand. "I cannot help him, Mom," I said, my voice echoing the same finality I had used on my porch. "He made his choices. Now he faces the consequences." Security guards materialized from the lobby, gently but firmly guiding Brenda and a stunned, silent Chloe toward the exit. The grand disruption they had planned ended with their complete and utter humiliation. The elite crowd on the terrace watched them leave, murmuring quietly amongst themselves. The truth of the Harrison family was now public knowledge. Julian wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me close. He kissed my temple, a grounding, reassuring gesture. "It is over," he whispered. I watched the heavy mahogany doors close behind my mother and sister. The chaotic noise of my childhood, the endless demands, the relentless sabotage had finally been silenced. I turned back toward the terrace, took a deep breath of the cool canyon air, and prepared to deliver my keynote address. The stage was mine, the narrative belonged to me, and the future was entirely unwritten. The aftermath of the Sedona Gala did not unfold slowly. It moved with the devastating velocity of a desert flash flood, washing away decades of lies, manipulation, and carefully constructed illusions. When the authorities escort a man out of a high-profile charity event in handcuffs, the societal fallout is instantaneous, but the legal consequences were far more severe. The Arizona Attorney General's office does not operate on country club timelines. They operate on documented evidence, and I had handed them a flawless paper trail. Thomas Harrison assumed he could talk his way out of the indictment. He hired a high-priced defense attorney, draining the last of his legitimate savings to mount a defense. He thought he could sit in a conference room, flash a charismatic smile, and convince the prosecutors that the forged signatures and the stolen Social Security numbers were merely a complex family misunderstanding. He believed his status would shield him. The prosecutors brought him into a harsh, fluorescent-lit interrogation room and placed the digital audit logs on the metal table. They showed him the time-stamped IP addresses, proving the fraud originated from his own living room. They presented the financial records detailing the $75,000 line of credit he had opened using my identity. The state offered him a stark choice. He could face a lengthy, highly publicized criminal trial with a guaranteed prison sentence, or he could accept a comprehensive plea deal. Faced with undeniable proof, the blustering patriarch finally crumbled. Thomas took the plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts of identity theft and insurance fraud. The judge did not show leniency. The sentencing required him to serve a period of strict house arrest, followed by 5 years of heavily monitored probation. But the most ruinous condition of the plea deal was the mandatory financial restitution. He was ordered to repay every stolen dollar, plus substantial state fines and legal penalties. To satisfy the court order, Thomas and Brenda were forced to liquidate their assets. The sprawling Mediterranean estate in Paradise Valley, the house that served as the ultimate symbol of their superiority, was placed on the market. It sold below market value to a cash buyer who wanted a quick closing. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Brenda wept openly as moving coordinators tagged her imported vases and antique furniture for an estate auction. They packed whatever belongings remained into a rented truck and relocated to a cramped, unremarkable apartment complex on the outskirts of Phoenix. Their country club membership was quietly revoked. The social circle they had spent 30 years cultivating abandoned them overnight. High society does not tolerate the stench of a felony conviction. Without Thomas's stolen funds to prop up their fabricated lifestyle, Chloe and Brad's reality disintegrated just as rapidly. The fraudulent line of credit my father had maintained was the only mechanism keeping Brad's failing ventures afloat. Once those accounts were frozen and seized by the federal investigators, the dominoes began to fall. Brad's creditors descended like vultures. The invoices for his leased office spaces, the unpaid vendor bills, and the massive credit card debt all came due simultaneously. They had no savings. They had no legitimate income. They had relied entirely on the strategy of extracting wealth from others. 2 weeks after my father's sentencing, Brad and Chloe officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The bankruptcy proceedings stripped away the final layers of their facade. The court-appointed trustee audited their spending habits and ordered the immediate repossession of their luxury vehicles. A tow truck arrived at their rental home in the middle of the night, hauling away the vehicles they used to project an image of success. Chloe was forced to sell her designer handbags and expensive jewelry just to afford basic living expenses. The sister who had thrown herself onto the floor of a steakhouse faking a cardiac event because she could not stand sharing the spotlight was now standing in line at a discount grocery store, stripped of everything she valued. The grand irony was that if she had simply congratulated me at dinner, if they had simply accepted my boundary, their hidden financial decay might have remained a secret for a few more years. Their desperate greed accelerated their own destruction. I observed the collapse of their empire from a safe, insulated distance. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate their misery. I simply returned to my job, focused on my upcoming marriage, and enjoyed the profound silence that now surrounded my life. However, toxic individuals rarely accept accountability, even when the wreckage of their choices is smoldering around them. 3 months after the house was sold, I received an email. The sender address belonged to Brenda. She had bypassed the blocks on my phone by creating a new email account. I sat at my kitchen island sipping a cup of dark roast coffee and opened the message. I expected a vitriolic attack, and Brenda did not disappoint. The email was a sprawling, unhinged manifesto of victimhood. She wrote thousands of words detailing her perceived suffering. She described the humiliation of living in a small apartment. She lamented the loss of her social standing. She detailed Chloe's struggles with the bankruptcy courts. But the core of the message was a venomous attempt to shift the blame entirely onto my shoulders. "You destroyed this family," Brenda typed, using bold lettering to emphasize her rage. "You handed your own flesh and blood to the authorities over a simple financial mistake. You have torn us apart. Your father is a broken man. Your sister is destitute. I hope your fancy title and your wealthy fiancé keep you warm at night because you have proven yourself to be a ruthless, ungrateful child. We will never forgive you for what you have done." I read the email twice. A few years ago, a message like this would have triggered a severe anxiety response. I would have internalized her accusations. I would have questioned my own morality, wondering if enforcing the law made me a bad daughter. Now, reading her words, I felt nothing but a cool, analytical detachment. Brenda's email was a textbook example of narcissistic deflection. She did not mention the identity theft. She did not acknowledge the insurance fraud. She took zero responsibility for the fact that they had plotted to steal my money, risk my career, and ruin my credit. In her mind, the crime was not the theft itself. The crime was that I had refused to be their victim. I realized a fundamental truth in that moment. Keeping toxic people in your life out of a misplaced sense of obligation is akin to drinking poison every single day and hoping the other person dies. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. You cannot negotiate with individuals who view your boundaries as an act of war. I did not type a reply. I did not defend my actions or point out the flaws in her logic. Engaging with her would only provide the emotional fuel she desperately craved. Instead, I forwarded the email directly to David Sterling, the hospital network's lead corporate counsel who had assisted me during the Sedona Gala. I attached a brief note requesting he issue a formal legally binding cease and desist order to my mother prohibiting any future contact. I then blocked the new email address, closed my laptop, and went for a long run in the morning sun. That was the last communication I ever received from the Harrison family. 6 months later, the scorching Arizona summer gave way to a crisp, vibrant autumn. Julian and I drove up the winding canyon roads toward Sedona. We had rented a secluded private estate tucked away among the towering red rock formations, surrounded by ancient juniper trees and vast open skies. We were getting married. There were no engraved gold foil invitations sent to hundreds of superficial acquaintances. There was no opulent ballroom or performative catering. We invited 40 people. The guest list consisted of the ER nurses who had supported Julian through grueling shifts, the hospital administrators who had mentored me, and the loyal friends who had stood by our sides. I wore a simple, elegant ivory gown that moved effortlessly in the gentle desert breeze. Julian wore a tailored charcoal suit. We stood on a flagstone terrace overlooking the canyon as the sun began to set, casting brilliant shades of copper, violet, and crimson across the sandstone cliffs. An acoustic guitarist played a soft melodic tune in the background. There was no drama. There were no fake medical emergencies designed to steal the spotlight. There were no screaming relatives demanding financial favors or attempting to ruin the evening. The air was filled with genuine laughter, quiet conversations, and profound, uninterrupted joy. As I stood across from Julian reciting the vows we had written ourselves, I looked at the small crowd of people smiling back at us. I realized I had finally found my home. I had discarded the broken lineage I was born into and constructed something beautiful from the ground up. This was the family I chose. These were the people who loved me for my character, my integrity, and my spirit, not for the resources they could extract from my bank account. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, Julian pulled me in for a deep, lingering kiss. The applause from our friends echoed into the canyon. We spent the rest of the evening dancing under a canopy of desert stars, drinking excellent wine, and celebrating a future that belonged entirely to us. The journey from the shadows of my childhood to the summit of my career was fraught with obstacles, engineered by the very people who should have championed my success. I had to learn how to sever ties with the architects of my misery. I had to learn how to weaponize the truth to protect my hard-earned sanctuary. If you are listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story, I want you to internalize a crucial lesson. If you are the capable one in your family, the reliable anchor, the sibling who works tirelessly while others coast on excuses, your success is not a communal asset. Your achievements are not a debt you owe to the people who mistreated you, neglected you, or minimized your worth. Do not let anyone convince you that sharing blood requires you to share your peace of mind. Establish your boundaries with the strength of a steel vault. Document the betrayals. Keep your receipts, whether they are text messages, voicemails, or digital logs, because toxic individuals will always attempt to rewrite history to cast themselves as the injured party. When they try to manipulate your reality, do not engage in screaming matches. Do not stoop to their level of emotional warfare. Gather your evidence, stand your ground, and never be afraid to let the unvarnished truth do the talking. The truth is a relentless force. It does not negotiate, and it does not retreat. Let it speak for you. Walk away from the noise, build a life that brings you profound joy, and surround yourself with people who celebrate your light instead of trying to extinguish it. You owe yourself that freedom. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope you find the courage to protect your own peace. I sit on the terrace of our new home in the foothills of the McDowell Mountains. Julian is inside the kitchen pouring coffee, and the morning air carries the clean scent of the desert. Looking back at the wreckage my parents and sister left in their wake, I realize that surviving a destructive family dynamic requires more than merely walking away. It demands a total rewiring of how you view love, loyalty, and your own inherent worth. The space they used to occupy in my mind is now filled with clarity. For decades, I was conditioned to believe my role was to absorb their chaos. Breaking that cycle was difficult, but the alternative was sacrificing my future to fund their delusions. Through this ordeal, I uncovered 5 distinct lessons that now govern how I live. First, competence is not a currency you owe to your relatives. Just because you possess the resources or the ability to fix a crisis does not mean you bear the responsibility to solve problems created by someone else's poor choices. Your success belongs to you. Second, always secure your paper trail. When dealing with individuals who routinely rewrite history to cast themselves as victims, relying on memory is a losing strategy. Hard evidence, digital logs, and physical documents form an undeniable shield against gaslighting and manipulation. Third, a biological tie does not equate to a binding contract. Society pushes the narrative that blood relations require infinite forgiveness. That is a trap. You hold the inherent right to sever ties with people who share your DNA if they view your achievements solely as a mechanism for their own gain. Fourth, deliberate silence is vastly more effective than reactive rage. Engaging in screaming matches only supplies toxic individuals with the emotional validation they desperately crave. Presenting factual truth and walking away deprives them of their leverage. Let their own actions dictate their downfall. Fifth, the family you actively choose will always provide more stability than the family you inherit through obligation. True love and respect should feel safe. They should never resemble a hostage negotiation or a transaction. I listen to the sound of Julian walking toward the patio doors. My career continues to thrive. My marriage rests on a foundation of mutual respect, and my daily peace is untouchable. If you are currently sitting in the shadow of relatives who refuse to recognize your value, I urge you to step into the light. You do not need their permission to construct a beautiful life. Thank you for sharing this journey with me today. If my experience brought you validation or comfort, please subscribe to Orange Revenge. Leave a comment sharing which of those 5 lessons struck the deepest chord with you. Take a moment to like this video so it can find its way to others who might need a reminder of their own strength. You have the right to protect your peace. I will see you in the next story.